black hole sun, won't you come wash away the rain, black hole sun, won't you.
Freewheelin, Meredith Oaks, Christie, Space Truckin'. Today, if you're not thinking about outer space, it's affecting you, whether you know it or not. Your GPS, your satellite radio that you're listening to right now, your cell phone, and so much more about life on Earth affected by space weather. And we have invited Tamitha Skov, the space weather woman, to talk about it. Thank you so much for taking the time.
You bet.
Thanks for joining us. What's up, Doc? The last space weather report you did was just yesterday. What's in the solar storm forecast?
Well, right now, actually, we are experiencing a solar storm. It's very weak because we are actually coming up to solar minimum. And that may be like, what in the world does that mean? It means the sun is going to kind of hibernate like a bear for a few years before it then wakes up and is voraciously hungry and starts firing off a lot of bigger storms. But right now we're dealing with a little small one, and there was a report of aurora in the Shetland, UK just last night. So we are getting a little bit of aurora right now.
So explain what space weather is to folks. There's stuff going on so far beyond our atmosphere, and explain what it is and how it affects us on a general level, and then we'll get into some of the specifics.
Oh, sure. Now, believe it or not, space weather is not that much different than terrestrial weather. There's all sorts of little different things that happen. You know, you get sunshine, you get rainstorms, you get hail, hurricanes. You get the same kind of stuff with space weather, believe it or not. Space is not really empty like most people believe it is. So you get things, I'm sure you've heard them, things like solar flares, things like solar storms. All of these things are slightly different, and they affect Earth all the time, but they affect it in different ways. And it depends upon really who you are, what you're doing. Again, GPS is one way that space weather can affect people, but it can also affect amateur radio communication. Obviously, it affects aurora photographers. It affects airline pilots and even people that fly in high-altitude airline flights, especially the ones that go transatlantic and over the poles, stuff like that. So there's a lot of different things, and I could go into the phenomena if you'd like.
Sure.
Well, is it largely based on the sun's space weather, or are there other things in space that can affect space weather?
There are a whole source of things that affect space weather. The ones that we care about mainly that affect life on Earth are going to be things from our star, our sun. It's the biggest, ball of gas that's spitting dangerous stuff at us all the time. But there are other sources of space weather. For example, cosmic rays from supernovas. They kind of bathe us in a bath of really radioactive particles, believe it or not. That's one of the reasons why space is it's so dangerous and hard to conquer. It's hard to keep satellites alive up there. It's hard to keep, it's hard to keep humans up there, and having us go to Mars is a very big challenge, despite the fact that most people think it should be as easy as Star Trek.
And there's no shortage of billionaires now they're having like a new kind of privatized space race.
Yes, and I think it's fantastic, except for the fact that they're not paying attention to space weather. And Elon Musk's little roadster with David Bowie's Starman, at the helm, that poor guy is getting dosed like he's never gotten dosed before, being out there in interplanetary space.
Yeah, we mentioned a little bit of how it's a biological hazard, supposedly, because he didn't clean it before.
Yeah, who knew that space stuff had to be cleaned first before it was shot through the atmosphere?
Well, but that's the thing about, do no harm, right? It's kind of almost a medical code where we don't really know what's out there. And if we really want to explore and figure out, what life might exist out there aside from us, then we better not contaminate whatever we're searching for. Otherwise, we're going to think we found life when in actuality, all we found was our own thumbprint. Yeah,
we brought it with us. What got you interested in space weather in the first place?
Oh, gosh. The funny thing is that I actually started out as an artist, and space, I had always loved space and sci-fi. And one of my, I already mentioned one of my favorite artists, which was David Bowie. And I loved how he was able to marry music with space. And I kind of did the same thing, but I did it more from a mathematical and physics standpoint. Was that I was an artist who was interested in space and I was reading sci-fi books, but then I started reading textbooks, and the textbooks in physics and mathematics were even more bizarre than even some of the biggest, strangest constructs that sci-fi novelists could create. So for me, the truth literally became stranger than fiction. And I gave up sci-fi novels for textbooks, for physics textbooks, especially ones that had to do with space. And then as I grew older and continued in school, I ended up getting involved with space physicists, and they gave me an opportunity to study the sun and get paid to do that. And so I said, absolutely. And I just went from UCLA through undergraduate all the way through my graduate career, studying space and still being a musician, believe it or not, on the side.
Oh, wow. Do you have a band? Or
I had for a long... Oh, I built a studio. I'm sitting in my studio right now. It started out as a recording studio, and I used to record underground Los Angeles bands. We did webcasts and did records for them. I probably produced anywhere between 60 and 100 bands over the course of maybe about 5-6 years.
Wow, now you consult with NASA and the American Meteorological Society. I can never say it. I couldn't consult with them. I can't say it. National Science Foundation and so much more. We're talking with the space weather woman, Tamitha Skov. So for our truck drivers who are so reliant upon GPS, upon cell phones, well, we all are, but them especially because it's life and work and on the road for weeks or months at a time sometimes, what should they know about space weather?
The biggest thing that they should know about space weather is if they're driving, for example, especially with GPS, I mean, you have to think about not just your cell phone having GPS, but all of the apps in your phones that use GPS. For instance, Waze, any type of traffic apps, Google Maps that has traffic applications, Uber, Lyft, all of those. If you're a driver, taxi driver, any of those types of things that use GPS, you're extremely susceptible to space weather. And there are two places. Mainly, you're susceptible at high latitudes especially underneath aurora. If aurora happens to be going on because of a solar storm that's hitting Earth, that's actually how the Earth kind of gets rid of all this extra energy that the sun spits at it. It basically lights up the upper atmosphere like a neon beer sun. Kind of cool.
Wow.
But that causes problems for big time.
Now, will this knock out a GPS? Because, I mean, years ago, there was an incident where somebody was misdirected by their GPS, and it turned out to be a solar event that did that. So the GPS might still work. It just would no longer provide an accurate guidance?
Well, yeah, there's several things that happen. Number one, I have to make sure that everyone realizes this. The GPS satellites are working fine. GPS or GLONASS, or BIDO, all these different types of geolocation satellites. Their signals are just fine. The problem is with, let's say, a solar flare, the sun sends out this huge radio burst. And this is just essentially a loud noise. The sun basically screams at Earth. And it screams so loudly that it drowns out the GPS satellite signal. It's kind of like the same thing as saying, okay, I can hear a cricket chirping near train tracks, but as soon as the train goes by, I can no longer hear the cricket. It doesn't mean the cricket's not chirping. It just means I can't hear it because the train's so loud. So it's the same thing with GPS. So that's sometimes what happens. And when that happens, typically the signals are so drowned out that the GPS units just can't get a lock. So in other words, they can't find satellites, so GPS just flat out doesn't work on your phone. Your receivers can't receive the signals.
And the same is true for satellite radio?
Yes, absolutely. Your Sirius XM satellite radio works on a frequency of 2.3 gigahertz. Now, that doesn't mean much to anybody, but when you look at GPS, that satellite frequency is 1.67 gigahertz. So 1.67 compared to 2.3, that's not much different. And you know what else works in that area? Satellite phones. Satellite phones are typically at 1.6 or 1.5 gigahertz. So they are affected too.
Oh, wow.
And that became a really... sorry.
So the military must have a keen interest in space weather.
Well, yeah, that's actually why I work for the Aerospace Corporation. They're an adjunct of the Air Force. So yes, I mean, our job is to keep the national assets safe and make all of that infrastructure all the space assets, make that infrastructure completely invisible to everyone else.
Well, are there any radio communications, whatever frequencies they might be on, that are unaffected by any of this, or is everything affected? That's the question du jour. If we could figure out frequencies that weren't affected by either space weather or terrestrial weather, we would all be in the clear. And we're working on technologies that do that, but they're not going to be in the same spectrum. Because what happens is that when you get satellite signals or certain frequencies that are affected by space weather, then they're good for terrestrial weather, but they're terrible for space weather. Then if you get them that they're not so bad for space weather, then they can't see through terrestrial weather. So they can't see like through rainstorms, and water affects them, and you get all those problems. So there's not really a single silver bullet that solves this problem, at least not yet.
I know we're talking about a lot of tech stuff and physics, but does space weather affect us physiologically, biologically, or our mood, or anything else like that?
Well, there are some people that are susceptible, and I've talked to many of them. These are people who are susceptible to like just the general magnetic fields. People who can't go into an MRI and feel comfortable, and they have problems with that. They have a certain kind of sensitivity that a lot of us don't have. And because our Earth, Earth has a magnetic field, right? The same field you read with a compass on the ground, it actually extends out into space. It becomes what I call the magnetic shield. And it sounds really sci-fi, but believe it or not, it's real. And this shield will wiggle and change and all this kind of stuff as it tries to protect us from what the sun throws at us. And this is partly why we have the aurora spark up when our magnetic shield basically has to dump all this extra energy. But people who are sensitive to changes in our magnetic field, kind of like migratory animals that have the same problem, they can feel, sometimes they get migraines, sometimes they feel sick to their stomach, or they just have a general malaise. There's a lot of research being done in this area right now in the medical field, but the research is just beginning. So I really can't say anything definitive, but that's what I've come across.
Now, I know back in 2014, there was a task force that was set up to try to come up with a defensive strategy against a large solar storm event, one that would take out the power grid, that could really cause a lot of havoc on Earth. Are we still funding that task force, or at the levels that you feel it should be funded at? And what else should we be doing to try to protect us from this solar storm there's supposedly a 10% chance of this thing happening at some point, which is a pretty high percentage if you think about it.
Right. I think the quote is actually from a colleague of mine, Pete Riley. It was 12%, he said, over the next, I think, decade. And yes, what the event you're talking about is called the Carrington Event. And actually, when that happened, it was actually 3 of them that year, believe it or not. And the nice thing is that we're not quite as susceptible to those events as we used to be. At least the power grid is not, because we've gotten a lot smarter. So we don't have hundreds and hundreds of miles of unbroken power lines that then can charge up, in a sense. These lines will, they're affected again by the Earth's magnetic shield. And the longer the lines run, the more our Earth's shield can affect them. Our Earth's magnetic field isn't very strong. It's only about as strong as a fridge magnet. But what makes it so intense is that it's a fridge magnet the size of Earth. So when people say, oh my gosh, it's going to hurt my pacemaker, or it's going to blow up the electronics in my car. No, a fridge magnet can't really do that unless, let's say, your pacemaker is the size of Lake Michigan. Then, over that large distance, then yes, it has a chance. But
truckers do have the biggest hearts.
That big.
Jeez, that's a big pacemaker. Wow.
Right. So
on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is like freaking out and 1 is I'm not at all concerned, how concerned are you?
About a Carrington class event?
About a Carrington level event that we're not prepared for.
Well, let me put it to you this way, and this will be a little bit frightening. This solar cycle, we've had 3 Carrington class events.
Yeesh.
We were clipped by 1, and it actually was last September, believe it or not, during Irma and Harvey and all of that mess. everybody was too busy looking at the hurricanes to realize that we had one of the scariest sets of events on the sun that we've had this entire cycle. As a matter of fact, all of the emergency communicators, the Red Cross, all the amateur radio operators, none of them were able to talk to people stranded in Puerto Rico and some people in Texas because the sun was making so much noise. It was killing GPS, it was killing satellite phone, and it was killing amateur radio, which is really the lifeline for people who have no power, have no cell phones, no nothing.
Right.
And one of my broadcasts, when I did a YouTube forecast for that particular set of weeks, that broadcast actually ended up on a state-run network in Russia that was reporting on the hurricanes, simply because there was no one else reporting on space weather and showing what was really going on and why all of these emergency communications weren't working.
Wow.
So this stuff happens more frequently than we realize. We just haven't known to look up. And that's what I'm trying to fix. This is what I'm trying to change.
Thank you for doing that.
But,
and by the way, are you a ham?
I am almost a ham. I'm
You're almost
close.
a ham.
I'm studying for my tech license right now.
Oh,
yes,
really?
Okay. Yes, I'm very close to I will probably take my tech license here in the next, within the next month.
Well, you'll be in good company. You can go find Joe Walsh. He's a ham radio operator, too.
And I think a lot of our drivers are hams as well.
Actually, I know Joe Walsh sort of because I am the weather girl for Ham Nation, which is run by Bob Heil, and Joe Walsh is Bob's really good friend.
Oh, awesome.
Oh, Bob Heil. I'm talking into a Heil microphone as we speak.
Oh, there we go.
Small world. Big planet, small world.
Yeah.
The work you do...
if you're a ham radio operator, you should tune into Ham Nation. If you don't, it's on Twit TV every week, and you'll see me I'm their weather girl.
Excellent. It's really been fascinating to speak with you. Join us again, won't you, please? It would be lovely.
Sure.
Yeah, we love a space weather forecast anytime. You can find Tamitha on Twitter at Tamitha Skov, S-K-O-V, at thespaceweatherwoman.com. That's the website with that's a portal for all your stuff.
Yep, that's it. And or you can just Google Space Weather Woman.
And
there's only one.
Next time, we'll talk about all the bands you produced as well.
That's right.
I'd like to hear about that.
Oh, okay.
That sounds like a whole other interesting life. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You bet. Thank you so much.
We'll try to keep you aware of these kind of things, because if your satellite radio goes out, that ain't good. It's not good for us. So there you go, some space weather, and we are in a period of activity right now.
Fascinating, right? There's a solar storm on right now. That was a real-time report from the solar storm.
Road Dog Truckin' Space Weather is brought to you by Crete.